Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a great show for you today. As always, I'm Amber Duke, joined again at the desk by Niall Standage.
Great to see you, Amber. Always a Friday treat to have these conversations with you.
Absolutely. Let's jump right into it. The world is reacting to President Trump's Liberation Day tariff extravaganza.
China, for instance, has already retaliated. That country said it would be imposing 34% tariffs on all US imports.
Then, China's Ministry of Commerce said it would effectively ban 11 American companies from doing business in China at all.
And then, of course, we have the markets. The Dow Jones dropped almost 1,700 points, or 4%. The S&P 500 dropped 274 points, which is about 4.8%. And the Nasdaq tanked 1,050 points, which is nearly 6%.
Here's President Trump during a gaggle yesterday.
It's to be expected. This is a patient that was very sick. We really inherited a terrible economy, as you know, with a lot of problems. It was a sick patient. It went through an operation on Liberation Day, and it's going to be a booming country. A very booming country. It's going to be amazing, actually.
And then there's the response in Congress. Republican Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa and Democratic Senator Maria Cantwell of Washington introduced legislation to limit Trump's tariff power. This would mean that the president would have to give Congress a 48-hour notice before imposing tariffs, and Congress would then have to approve the measure within 60 days. In another instance earlier this week, 4 Republicans joined Senate Democrats in a vote to block Trump's tariffs on Canada. That measure passed in a 51-48 vote. Cantwell said in a statement, "Arbitrary tariffs, particularly on our allies, damage US export opportunities and raise prices for American consumers and businesses. As representatives of the American people, Congress has a duty to stop actions that will cause them harm."
Not everyone is all doom and gloom over Trump's tariffs, however. When Trump imposed tariffs on automobiles and light trucks in late March, the United Auto Workers president, Shawn Fain, said, "We applaud the Trump administration for stepping up to end the free trade disaster that has devastated working-class communities for decades. Ending the race to the bottom in the auto industry starts with fixing our broken trade deals, and the Trump administration has made history with today's actions." It's notable that Fain has been a staunch anti-Trump critic. Ethan Lane of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association said in a statement on April 2nd, "For too long, America's family farmers and ranchers have been mistreated by certain trading partners around the world. President Trump is taking action to address numerous trade barriers that prevent consumers overseas from enjoying high-quality, wholesome American beef."
Meanwhile, businessman Mark Cuban has some advice for the current moment. He wrote on Blue Sky, "It's not a bad idea to go to the local Walmart or big box retailer and buy lots of consumables now. From toothpaste to soap, anything you can find storage space for, buy before they have to replenish inventory. Even if it's made in the USA, they will jack up the price and blame it on tariffs." So I think we'll probably get off to a vigorously disagreeing start here, Amber. It seems to me that this is a very clear example of a cause and effect that has hit the markets very badly. President Trump introduces these tariffs, the bottom falls out of the market, between $2 and $3 trillion of value in the stock market wiped out in one day. As we are talking right now on Friday morning, the markets have declined further. I think that firstly, that calls into question the wisdom of the policy in a very serious way. Secondly, it hurts around 160 million Americans who are invested in the stock market, in either directly or indirectly through 401ks. And thirdly, I think the attitude, particularly from more conservative-leaning media to it, has been pretty absurd. I mean, one can only imagine if former President Biden or former President Obama did something like this and there was that amount of value evaporated from the stock market. I don't think some of the people making excuses for President Trump would be making excuses for them.
I don't think it's necessarily an excuse so much as a recognition that perhaps a temporary stock market crash or dip, if whatever you want to call it, is necessary to addressing these trade imbalances and really bringing back the American working middle class. Over the past 3 decades, we have seen trade imbalances around the world increase rather significantly, not least of which because we decided to recognize China as a favorable nation through our trade policy, and the manufacturing base in the United States has been wiped out through those policies. We have a massive group of people who either don't have the skills or education or frankly shouldn't have to do that in order to participate in which has largely become a service economy because we no longer make products here in the United States of America. And so the tariffs are addressing a larger symptomatic problem of the American economy's lack of robust health that I think it's a bit myopic to only look at the stock market as an indicator of how much of a positive impact this will have on the American people.
So, first of all, in relation to the hollowing out of American manufacturing, that is obviously a problem, and it has obviously hurt people in a pretty profound way. And if you, I can't remember now where in the US you're originally from, but if you...
Western Maryland.
Western Maryland, okay. So if you travel further out and further into the Midwest and Ohio and Pennsylvania and Indiana, Ohio, there are obviously communities that have been very hard hit by that hollowing out of manufacturing. Now, the question is this policy going to bring those back? Or is there, firstly, automation is part of that picture as well in terms of the hollowing out of American manufacturing. Whether the reliance on service industries means the American economy is unhealthy, I think, is highly questionable. But there's also this division in the policy that Trump is pursuing right now, where is he going to keep these tariffs in effect for long enough to regenerate American manufacturing in a serious way, because it takes time, obviously, to build new factories and all the rest of it? Or is this a negotiating position? We mentioned in our introduction, among people defending Trump, the Cattlemen's Association or whatever. I noticed in their press release, they talk about the fact that there are unfair tariffs. There's a country, the name now escapes me who it is, who tariffs American beef but not Australian beef, and the cattlemen are outraged about that. Perhaps they should be outraged about that, but that is something that can be fixed in negotiation pretty quickly and is a separate push from the longer term massive tariffs to boost American manufacturing.
Yeah, and Howard Lutnick has talked about this. He has said that countries have to make concessions if they want tariff relief. I think there's certain cases where it makes sense, where if a country decides to get their tariffs on U.S. exports down to zero, the president would respond in kind. China, I view as a separate category because there are a lot of other geopolitical factors at play there in terms of them stealing intellectual property, artificially deflating their currency, really engaging in really scammy ways on the market that are impacting Americans regardless of whether or not they have tariffs or reciprocal tariffs in response. I think in regards to the EU, Canada, Mexico, there's probably certain deals that could be made that would cause Trump to bring tariffs down a bit. But I do believe overall, if you listen to people like Robert Lighthizer, Peter Navarro, even if you go back to the 90s and listen to Pat Buchanan, this has to be a longer-term strategy to try to reshore American manufacturing, and not just for economic reasons, but for national security reasons. During World War II, America was able to quickly ramp up production during the war in order to create weaponry, to build tanks, to build planes, to outfit our troops with the best possible goods. We are in a situation now where if, God forbid, America were involved in a war, or if we had to stave off a war, we are reliant on countries that could potentially be enemies of ours in a war to provide products like steel, timber, batteries, microchips that we can't produce here. And we saw this during the pandemic in 2020. China was hoarding PPE and refusing to give it to countries unless they paid a steep bill in order to get those products, pharmaceuticals as well. So reshoring manufacturing is both great for the economic health of the middle class and also a national security imperative.
So I think two things. One is the American people, are the American people, I should say, willing to bear this amount of pain where there is about half the population invested in the stock market losing money right now? Are they willing to bear that pain for the resurgence of manufacturing if it happens? Just briefly, because I think it can be easy to get into the generalities of this. I looked up one of the countries tariffs are being imposed on, which is Bangladesh. 37% tariff on Bangladesh. Bangladesh is mainly an exporter of garments to the United States. The average monthly wage in Bangladesh is $213. The average wage in the United States is about $5,500 gross. I don't see any way that tariffs, unless they are just astronomical, can redress that difference. And in the meantime, Americans are going to be paying more for their T-shirts.
I think it's fair to say that there are some industries that it doesn't make sense to reshore to America, and there are others that do, and particularly things like automobile manufacturing. Americans make great cars, but they're more expensive. because we expect that American workers get paid a decent wage, that they have labor protections. A lot of these workers are in unions like the UAW, and that should be how we treat our workers. And unfortunately, a lot of companies have decided against the national interest that they are going to use cheaper labor abroad in order to cut down Americans' wages because they value a cheaper car over making sure that we have a robust and healthy middle class. And
but a lot of Americans value buying a cheaper car rather than necessarily supporting American manufacturers.
They do, and I think they're wrong.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, one of the things where I think we might have some disagreement is that income inequality has become an increasing problem in American society. This is something that a lot of really aggressive free market people will say is no big deal because the economy's not a zero-sum game, right? When the rich get richer, then everybody else comes up with them. A rising tide lifts all boats. But that's not the case with the way that our current trade imbalance works, because the money that we're spending on all of these goods that are produced by these wealthy people is either going to the wealthy people or being exported to other countries. Those dollars aren't staying in America. So that's not a sustainable way of running an economy, in my opinion. And there are basically two ways that you can address that income inequality, which leads to all kinds of societal ills and disunity and discordance. One is to tax the rich and redistribute the money to the lower classes. The other is to have a mass tariff policy and try to make sure that these people have productive, meaningful work. And I would view the latter as a healthier, more productive way to run an economy.
And of course, I would view the former as a more healthy, but you knew that anyway. We have a lot more topics to talk about on Rising right after this. Stay with us.
The battle between two factions of the right, the neocon wing and the America First wing, just got a lot more serious. Per the New York Times, Trump has fired at least 6 members of his National Security Council.
The move came a day after right-wing activist and provocateur Laura Loomer paid a visit to the president. She reportedly urged Trump to fire certain NSC officials. A source familiar told Axios that the firings were being labelled as an anti-neocon move.
Here's President Trump last night addressing the incident.
I'm asking about the NSC. How many staffers were let go and why? Your National Security Council. How many staffers were let go?
There was some. Always we're going to let go of people that we don't like, or people that we don't think can do the job, or people that may have loyalties to somebody else. You'll always have that.
Tell us a little bit about your meeting with Laura Loomer and Mike Waltz today, and how that came about.
So Laura Loomer is a very good patriot. She is a very strong person, and I saw her yesterday for a little while. She makes recommendations.
What did she recommend?
She recommended certain people for jobs.
Adding to the administration, not
Adding.
Who did she
not
recommend?
firing?
Well, she'll recommend that too. But yesterday she recommended some people for jobs.
Did she have anything to do with the NSC aides who were ousted?
No, not her.
In the past, Loomer has amplified the idea that the 9/11 attacks were a, quote, inside job. She has also a long record of making anti-Islam and anti-immigrant remarks.
On top of the NSC officials, Trump also fired National Security Agency Director General Timothy Haw, per the Washington Post. Haw's civilian deputy, Wendy Noble, was also reportedly fired. Loomer told the Washington Post that she had advocated for both of these firings. She took to X and wrote, "NSA Director Tim Haw and his deputy Wendy Noble have been disloyal to President Trump. That is why they have been fired."
Loomer got into more detail with the Post. According to her, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, handpicked Haw to lead the NSA's Cyber Command. Trump's Pentagon stripped Milley's security detail in January.
Milley has reportedly called Trump a fascist in the past. Trump also accused Milley of treason for holding phone calls with his Chinese counterpart. During that call, Milley reportedly assured his counterpart that the U.S. would not launch a nuke.
Senator Mark Warner of Virginia wrote on X, "It is astonishing that President Trump would fire the nonpartisan, experienced leader of the NSA while still failing to hold any member of his team accountable for leaking classified information on a commercial messaging app. Even as he apparently takes staffing direction on national security from a discredited conspiracy theorist in the Oval Office." So I know you want to get into what is a genuinely rich seam here, which is the battle between more America First type people and more neocon or multilateral type people. But first of all, just indulge me while I make the anti-Laura Loomer case, because I think she's a particularly implausible person to be taking advice from on any kind of national security. We mentioned some of her record in the past. At one point, I was looking at old tweets of hers where she's celebrating the death of migrants crossing the Mediterranean. The 9/11 stuff caused a lot of backlash. Kamala Harris, she talked about if she's elected, the White House will be smelling of curry or something of that to that effect. She's a fundamentally disreputable person. And I think that one of the fears that people have is obviously about her being invited into the Oval Office to lend this advice. So there we go.
Yeah, I don't disagree about your assessment of Laura Loomer. I don't view her as a very serious person. When she was flying with Trump during the campaign on Air Force One, there was a lot of backlash from conservatives, actually, who said, hey, Trump, this is not going to make you look good having Laura Loomer on this plane flying around with you as if she's a member of the campaign, and she was sort of summarily pushed out from that. And I do think it is probably not in Trump's best interest to have her in the White House making staffing decisions. This is a case for me of even a broken clock is right 2 times a day. These individuals were appointed by Joe Biden. Trump, during his first term, had a serious problem with members of the quote-unquote deep state really pushing against his foreign policy decisions and actively undermining them. If these individuals were indeed found to have been basically pushing back against his more America First vision of foreign policy, if it's true that Ha was chosen by Mark Milley and that Wendy Noble was a protege of James Clapper, those are both legitimate reasons, I think, for them to be fired.
So I have some level of sympathy for that, in that I sometimes think people from the liberal or left side push back against the idea that a president has the right, particularly within his administration, for that administration to be staffed by people who support his views. Like, that doesn't seem like it should be that controversial to me. I do think there's a separate issue when it gets beyond that into the sort of civil service and so on, which is a whole other debate about political appointees. But when it comes to something like the National Security Council, yes, I think it is valid for Trump to say he wants people supportive of his worldview in those positions. Whether I would have that worldview is completely beside the point, because I wasn't elected President of the United States. So yes, he has that right. I do wonder, though, firstly, these people are, I think, fairly obscure to most of the public, and they're certainly fairly obscure to me, so I have no idea if these accusations being leveled against them are in fact true or not. And then the broader issue here, I think, is the argument, or the implicit argument, that these guys may have been involved somehow in the Signalgate matter, or that somehow there was, I don't know, some leaking or something went on there. To me, the Signalgate thing was just a fundamental act of incompetence. I haven't seen any evidence that pushes back against that interpretation of it. So I predicted, actually, that there'd be some suggestion at some point that, oh, it was all the deep state's fault. I am highly skeptical of that argument on Signalgate. That does not neutralize the argument that Trump is entitled to people who support his views.
Yeah, the Signalgate argument is not compelling to me. That was an F up by Mike Waltz, obviously.
Exactly. Yeah.
And Hegseth, frankly, for sharing details of that strike in the chat. Even if he didn't know Jeffrey Goldberg was there, you shouldn't be communicating in that way on non-government channels.
Right.
I mean, we've agreed on that from the jump. Going back to these allegations, as you said, I have no way of verifying these as of yet. I haven't had the time to actually dig in and see how verified they are. I would imagine that if Laura Loomer went in and presented some kind of compelling evidence, then Trump was persuaded by, then that would give him the gumption to go ahead and fire these people. I don't think he's the type of person who would just take Loomer's word for it, but I could be wrong.
The Loomer dossier, I hope they make it
They definitely got Loomered, but
yeah.
If it is true that Timothy Ha was chosen by Mark Milley, I mean, in addition to the call with China that we talked about, he was also one of the architects of the Afghanistan withdrawal policy, which was obviously a huge disaster. He's talked about things like white rage and white privilege in the military, which is leads to great disunity among ranking members of the military, men and women in uniform, where the common goal should be defending America, making sure that you're battle ready, and not getting into quibbles over who has more or less privilege when you're serving alongside people who might be of a different race or gender than you. So if that's the case, that he was chosen by Mark Milley, then see you later. I have no problem with that. And James Clapper is accused of lying to Congress over whether or not the NSA was spying on Americans. Someone who, in my opinion, has been totally discredited and has no business having any of his proteges or handpicked successors serving in the government at this point. So we have yet to see if those allegations are true. If they do turn out to be true, then I say, don't let the door hit you on the way out.
Yeah, I mean, I know we have to wrap up here in a second, but I mean, you and I have different views on DEI initiatives and the importance of them. That would be a whole other conversation. In relation to Clapper, I do find it very peculiar and not very impressive on the part of the left or Liberals that they have become so aligned with a kind of national security establishment, and it has become, I think, common to assume in liberal-leaning circles that the security apparatus never lies, which did not used to be the Liberal position, going back to awful stuff that was done against Martin Luther King and others. So I find that peculiar, and I take your point on James Clapper.
Awesome. All right, up next, there's a battle in Congress over proxy voting. We'll discuss or debate. Stick around, find out. The House has been shut down for the better part of a week after 9 Republican members voted with Democrats against Speaker Johnson and party leadership.
So this all started when Florida Representative Anna Paulina Luna put together a petition that would force a vote on a new House rule to allow proxy voting for new parents in Congress. Put more simply, this rule would essentially allow someone else to vote on bills and issues in the House in place of a sitting member of Congress.
Speaker Johnson slammed the Republican defectors earlier this week, arguing that proxy voting is unconstitutional. Take a listen.
96% of House Republicans voted against proxy voting because they believe it's unconstitutional and they agree that it would open a Pandora's box. And so that's what we just saw. It's very unfortunate. We'll regroup and come back and we'll have to do this again.
Meantime, Congresswoman Anna Paulina Luna, a new mother herself, argues that it supports family values and allows parents in Congress to do their job while taking care of their newborns.
And proxy voting isn't unprecedented. During the pandemic, then Speaker Nancy Pelosi instituted something broadly similar to keep Congress running while social distancing requirements were in place. So, does this support families or is it unconstitutional? Amber, one of the reasons I enjoy our conversations is that I'm often very curious to know what you think, especially when it's a topic I don't have a massively strong view on myself.
Sure.
You come down and
I am against proxy voting.
Okay.
For a couple of reasons. First of all, I am quite in line with the argument that it's unconstitutional. The Quorum clause in the United States Constitution indicates that there has to be a quorum of members actually present in the body in order for laws to be passed, for business to be done. And I think the idea that the founders envisioned some case where people were able to write letters back at that time to their other members in the House, and in this case, call them on the phone to vote on their behalf would have been outrageous to them. It was obviously hard to travel in those days. It took a long time, and yet somehow everybody was still able to make it in person to cast their votes. And one of the manipulations that's been happening from some of these Republicans and then the Democrats is the idea that it's pro-family. I mean, first of all, I would point out that you can have your newborn on the House floor. You can be in person with your baby and cast your vote, and that's perfectly acceptable. But the idea that we're supposed to get rid of this quorum clause, not expect you to show up for work because of a decision you made in terms of family rearing, I think is an indication that maybe you shouldn't have run for Congress if that was what you intended on doing. I know I'm probably surprising you right now, but I think it is the reality.
Yeah.
And we talked about this some last week as well in terms of women making choices about family and child rearing, that if your choice is between you want to stay home and raise your baby or you want to take it in and cast your vote on the House floor with your baby, he or she, little bundle of joy, I just, it's odd to me that the argument is that they should get to have it both ways.
I mean, I'll have to take the other side of the argument just for entertainment's sake here.
Sure.
As I say, it's not an issue that keeps me awake much at night, but unlike newborn babies, when those are around. But the thing here is that it doesn't seem to me that much of a stretch when we're in a very different world than the founders envisioned, and there are all kinds of provisions in the workplace generally for people who are new parents, be that mothers or fathers. And so the Anna Paulina Luna provision, as I understand it, was for 12 weeks. You could have up to 12 weeks you could nominate a proxy. Then at the end of that 12-week period, that was done. It doesn't seem outrageous to me to think, A, there's a secure way to do that, so there's no suggestion of, somebody impersonating you or casting fake votes. And it doesn't really seem a massive infringement on it. Whose rights are hurt by it, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I mean, outside of the constitutional standpoint, I would say that there's more to being a member of Congress than just hopping on Zoom and saying aye or nay to a piece of legislation, right? There's debates that are going on the House floor. There's amendment processes. There's an entire day usually of people having to be there and engage with their counterparts in Congress before they cast that vote. And so it just seems like they're shirking a lot of that responsibility. And when you run for Congress, you make a pledge on behalf of the American people that you're going to represent them in your full capacity that you can. And so deciding to sit at home, for good reason, mind you, to raise your kids, seems like a dereliction of that oath that you took. And I would also say, the first time that this proxy voting was implemented was during the pandemic. This was meant to be an extraordinary circumstance where people literally could not or were not supposed to gather in person for fear of spreading a very contagious virus. And to now extend that for it to become a normalcy, I think sets a very bad precedent.
I do take the thin end of the wedge argument. Like I was saying about Luna's case, that it's like, at the moment it's 12 weeks. I get the conservative or counter argument, which is to say, well, once it's 12 weeks, you've conceded the principle, and then people say 20 weeks and 24 weeks, and then it becomes you're entitled to your first year off. I guess I'm just less hostile than you to the idea of making an accommodation for people so that they can in fact do both to a degree, that they can take care of a newborn at home and still attend to the basics of being a member of Congress. Because it seems to me that if you deny that choice, then you actually take those members who do decide to stay home with a newborn child out entirely of the duty to represent their constituents. They have made that decision because it's personally vital to them. There seems to me to be a way to respect that choice and not bar them or eliminate them from doing the basics to continue representing their constituents.
I suppose the sticking point for me is you mentioned the duty to represent. And I think fundamentally you're not really doing that duty if you're not willing to show up and engage in the full process of lawmaking. And even if they weren't serving as a member of Congress, they still have the right to vote. They can put someone in there who represents their values or shares their values. Yeah, it's just hard for me to buy the argument that when you're at home taking care of a newborn, you're fully engaged in your duties as a member of Congress.
Do you think this issue has split Republicans or conservatives? Like, is there a big division of opinion on this, in your opinion, in conservative circles?
I just in the chatter that I've heard, most people land where I'm at, but obviously there's enough on the conservative Republican side to go against Speaker Johnson. I mean, I think there's also two sort of interesting things going on here at the same time, which is that you have these minority members of the Republican Party saying that it's a pro-family issue, and the Democrats are basically lobbying for it because it's an extension of the pandemic policies that they voted for back in 2020.
Well, I think they're framing it at least as a pro-family policy.
I bet they are.
Oh, Amber, cynicism about Democrats from this year. We have a lot more topics to talk about on Rising right after this. Stay with us. A new owner may be on the horizon for TikTok, and the deal could be reached before the ban on the popular social media app is set to take effect this Saturday.
Amazon has made an 11th-hour bid to acquire the video-sharing platform from Chinese company ByteDance, but their offer could be a long shot.
People familiar with the negotiations say that the involved parties don't seem to be taking Amazon's bid all that seriously. Those talks have been led by Vice President J.D. Vance, who took to Fox News yesterday to discuss it. Let's take a look.
We've been working very hard, me and the president, the entire team, to really accomplish two things. First of all, you want to make sure that the TikTok app in the United States is not spying on people.
Right.
That's good for national security. You also want to give people access to this incredible platform, which, as we know, that's where a lot of young people get their news. That's where a lot of young people found out about the policies of the Trump administration. And we got to accomplish both of those things. I think that we're in a good place. We're going to keep on working at it, but I'll let the president make that announcement.
If it doesn't come out before the deadline, because I know the president extended.
It'll come out before the deadline.
It will come out.
We had a couple days to continue working on it, to finalize some things. And of course, we're going to let the president announce whatever we ultimately decide.
President Trump has vowed repeatedly to save the app. He's in fact made it a key part of his agenda and has touted his efforts to extend the ban deadline by 75 days.
Microsoft, Perplexity AI, Oracle, and private equity firm Blackstone have all expressed interest in buying or investing in the company. The question now is, will there really be a deal before Saturday's ban? So, obviously Trump has been a little bit all over the map in terms of his overall history with this. He was once opposed to TikTok and suggested a ban. Then he got on it, got lots of followers and said there was a great idea.
Funny how that works.
Yeah, exactly. It's weird how that goes. It is certainly interesting that he initially extended this 75-day, or he extended it by 75 days before this goes into effect. I've obviously no idea whether Amazon's bid is serious or not, but it's an interesting story, I think, because there is, I think, legitimate national security concern, at least to some degree, and yet it's an app that millions and millions of Americans and I use. So there we are.
I did not know you were on TikTok.
Oh yes, I'm up down with the kids, Amber.
Yeah, you're way hipper than I am, I guess. I do not have an account, but I would say one of the fundamental problems with a lot of the deals that have been made is that it doesn't seem like ByteDance, or the CCP rather, is interested in making a deal. They want to have it both ways. They want to retain ownership of the app and continue to operate in the United States. And this legislation that passed last year has made it very clear that that's not a possibility. So Amazon can offer billions of dollars for this app, but if the CCP doesn't sign off on ByteDance actually ceding ownership and control of the app, then there's no chance that they can make that deal happen. So I'm curious to see what the Trump administration's negotiations actually look like. Trump has said in interviews that he believes that they will make a deal, but he said, I haven't received any information from the CCP effectively that they are even interested in negotiating. Yep. So I am skeptical, let's say, of the idea that this will be concluded by tomorrow.
Right, and to that exact point, the fact that the CCP and ByteDance are so reluctant to cede that control obviously sharpens the concerns around it.
Exactly.
Then there's the question of, well, why are you so desperate to hold on to it? And I've always thought that in terms of the security issues around TikTok, to me it's less about harvesting people's data, because in most people's case, yes, I wish data was more protected than it is, but there are enormous capacities to unfortunately surveil people, whether that's by American companies or Chinese companies. I do think there is a legitimate concern about tweaking the algorithm or inserting content that is intended to be in some fashion divisive or inflammatory toward Americans, or otherwise serve a political purpose. That to me seems a separate issue from the point that other people have made, which is it being kind of targeted because certain kind of views, particularly perhaps pro-Palestinian or quote-unquote anti-Israeli views, are more commonly viewed there. That seems to me a separate argument from, is the Chinese government seeking to sort of push inflammatory content toward Americans? Yeah,
I agree with that. I've been long skeptical of the idea that the U.S. government wants to ban the app just because people are saying pro-Palestinian things. I mean, that's all over X too. I don't think that is exclusive to TikTok by any means. And it is well established that China does manipulate the algorithm in order to sow national discord, in order to elevate viewpoints that are anti-American, pro-China. I mean, you can see the difference between what is served to users on the app in the United States versus what's served to users on the app in China, and it becomes very obvious what they are doing. And then on the data front, the data privacy front, I do think it matters when we're talking about data harvesting from American companies versus Chinese companies. I think you could obviously say both are bad, and we need more data protection. But when you're talking about a U.S. company, you have oversight over them. Congress has oversight. You can elect officials who seek to hold those companies accountable for what they're doing, who can pass legislation that makes those practices illegal and provides some kind of redress to the victims of those policies. When the company is owned by China, you don't have any say-so in the matter. We have no control over what they're doing with your data. There's a reason why it's banned from government devices, why a lot of people don't even have TikTok on their personal devices when they serve in government, because this threat has been established to be so real, and there's nothing that the U.S. can do about it.
Yeah, I think those are fair points, to be in all fairness. I think that there is a separate question about if there is no deal, because ByteDance doesn't sell or for any other reason, then does the ban go into effect? Does Trump actually say, okay, we'll go ahead and ban this? Because it does seem to me that in a simpler kind of framing, Trump took away TikTok. There could be people genuinely unhappy about that.
Sure.
It seems to me that the political downside of enacting a ban is probably bigger than the political downside of letting it run, even though there are these security concerns that we're talking about.
I think that's reasonable. I mean, Trump performed really well with young people in this last election, and a lot of young people are on TikTok. And the framing that it would be Trump's fault would be potentially very politically damaging to that new coalition of voters that he was able to cobble together in November. I think if Trump wants to message this properly, he basically has to let the courts force his hand. If he tries to do another extension, for example, and a court says you can't do that, you've already basically maxed out the number of days that you can put off this deal, and the ban is going into effect, this is passed through Congress, then Trump has to effectively make the case, hey guys, I did my best. The courts are it's more lawfare.
I would find that unusually respectful of court decisions by Trump if he did that, but perhaps he will. We have a lot more topics to talk about on Rising, so stick with us.
Congressman Glenn Ivey was in the spotlight mid-March when he became the first Democratic lawmaker on Capitol Hill to call for the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer to step down.
Fast forward 2 weeks, Schumer hasn't gone anywhere, but the Democratic Party continues floundering, at least according to some polls. A Harvard Capps-Harris poll released recently found the party is at an 8-year low. 37% of voters said they approved of the party in March, just slightly up from 36% in February. Joining us to discuss where the party goes from here is Democratic Representative from Maryland's 4th District, Glenn Ivey. Welcome, Congressman.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So I just wanted to get your reaction to some news today, because we quoted one poll in the introduction there, but I'm sure you saw Data for Progress, a progressive organization, is out with a new poll, and it included testing your colleague, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, against Senate Minority Leader Schumer in a Senate primary among likely Democratic voters. And the Congresswoman got 55% and the Senate Minority Leader 36%. What's your reaction to that? What do you think that says about the party generally?
I don't really know what to make of that, but I think from the standpoint of where the party's going as a whole right now, and our poll numbers have been low. I think in the generic polls, I think in the House, certainly, which is where there's the best chance for taking the majority back, our individual polling numbers are really strong. I think I'm at 90%, for example. And I think the other part of this, too, to pay attention to is what's going to happen to polls overall with Donald Trump and Elon Musk, especially in the wake of these tariffs. I mean, I heard people talking about circuit breakers today with respect to the impact on the stock market. I haven't heard that talk in a long time. And so this is going to be an across-the-board impact from an economic standpoint on every American at every level. And it flies in the face of the promises he made, which was he was going to help make a better economy and put money in people's pockets. Instead, he's taking it out. I mean, Bidenomics, people were complaining about 6 months ago, is starting to look pretty good now. And then the other part, too, along the lines of the direction the Democrats are moving in, we've had a couple of good weeks here. The Supreme Court win in Wisconsin, I think, was a big pivotal moment. and certainly from the standpoint of potential redistricting in that state. The two Florida seats that we didn't gain them, but those were plus 30 and 36 Trump's districts. I think the numbers, the Democrats lost by in the 14 to 15 range. So, those numbers have cut by more than half. And Trump's been making a lot of mistakes, frankly. I think the public's getting tired of him. They're getting tired of Elon Musk. And I think there's going to be a real strong pressure, especially in the wake of the economic impact, to get some kind of a check on the Trump administration. And I think the House will be the first place people look.
Getting into your fight with Chuck Schumer, is your contention that you feel that Schumer has not been doing a good enough job of fighting against the Trump administration? And if you were to have a conversation with him right now, what would you recommend that he do to win back disaffected Democrats?
Well, I think I was pretty clear at the time I made that statement. It was the deep disappointment with the vote on the continuing resolution. And I think that's been borne out by the continued and massive cuts to government employees. And I think we had an additional 20,000 with respect to HHS just a few days ago. And they continue to be doing this across the board. And I think it was the first chance for members of the Democratic Party in the House and the Senate to actually have a chance to push back, to fight back against the Trump administration. And it was a big missed opportunity in my view. So my hope is that, everybody has decided we need to get on the same page and oppose and fight the Trump administration when and where we can. We're going to have another shot at this one in 6 months. So hopefully, he'll be on the right page with us by then. And the other point, too, I think there's a huge development in the Senate is Cory Booker. His 25-hour speech, I thought, was really energizing and inspiring to Democrats, not just in the Senate, but in the House and across the country in a way that I haven't seen in a long time. So, it's clear that there's strong Senate leadership, and we support that effort. I went over and, as did many other House Democrats, we sat on the House floor in support of Cory and what he was doing, and I think that was a strong piece. And then the last thing I'll mention, and there's these rallies that are now growing across the country. There's a grassroots pushback. There's a big national rally coming up. I don't know when this is going to show, but it's going to be Saturday, which is tomorrow from the time we're taping this. And it's in all 50 states. They're expecting tens of thousands of people to be showing up at these different locations. And I think that's going to be a strong unifying statement as well. So, and I forgot to mention the courts. We continue to win in courts to such an extent that Republicans are frustrated now and have started talking about dramatic and, extreme measures like impeachment and, trying to threaten these judges. But the federal judges are staying strong. They continue to put injunctions in place that slow down what the Trump administration is trying to do, or in some instances, tell them to reverse it, reinstate fired government employees, bring back, people who were deported and the like. I think that's going to be coming in the near future. So I think we're moving in the right direction in Congress, in the courts, and in the communities.
Your mention of Senator Booker, Congressman, invites an obvious question. Would Senator Booker be a better Senate Democratic leader than Senator Schumer?
Well, I don't even know if Cory's interested in being a leader. That's something that would have to be directed to him. But I think at the end of the day, the key point is that the Democrats in Congress, the House and the Senate, get on the same page. We can't allow another mishap like we had with the continuing resolution. We've got to be able to work together on those fronts and make sure when we get those opportunities, we make the most of them.
But I don't want to...
Just the other day, we had bills on the House floor that were voted down. Now, not as important as the continuing resolution, but I think it does show that there's the potential to peel off House Republicans if we continue to apply pressure in the right districts. And I think the votes that I just mentioned in Florida and the congressional races and the Supreme Court race in Wisconsin are big steps in the right direction on that front.
Well, sure, but I just want to be clear, because it seems like the Senator Schumer's position on the continuing resolution was not just a problem in and of itself, but sort of eroded your confidence in his leadership more generally. No?
Well, I mean, as I said, it was, the first chance we had to really fight back against the Trump administration. He chose to lead a contingent of Democrats to vote in support of the Trump position. In fact, to such an extent that, you got the thank you note from Donald Trump. Whenever you get that, if you're a Democrat, if you're getting thank you notes from Donald Trump, you're in the wrong spot. So my view is that was a huge miss. We need to not allow any more missed opportunities like that, especially of that magnitude. We're only going to get a few shots at this because he's trying to do most of this through executive order, so he doesn't have to use legislation. I think he's running out of space to do that, and eventually he's going to have to come back to us. But in the short run, when we get a chance to do something on the legislative front, we've got to do it. And we've got to do it in a way that's unified and coordinated and strong. And that was not what happened on that CR vote.
I wanted to ask you, while we have you, about a more local issue. The Maryland Senate recently approved a budget that includes $1.68 billion in tax and fee increases. It's the largest in history. The Maryland Department of Legislative Services at the end of Hogan's term projected a surplus in the budget through 2027. That changed after Governor Wes Moore instituted his first budget. Now they're projecting a deficit, which is why this tax increase has apparently gone through. What's your message to Marylanders who are rightfully very concerned about the impact that this tax and fee increase is going to have on their pocketbooks?
Well, it looks like Hogan hit the ball, frankly. I think he maybe cooked the books a little bit and sort of left, Wes with a big bad surprise when he got there. And the Governor Moore stated that, when he first got there, and they had a chance to take a look at the books over a year ago. So I don't know that this is a big surprise where we are. What is a big surprise is that the federal government is actually attempting to essentially undermine not just Maryland, but states and communities across the country. For example, we just heard about the $418 million in cuts to Maryland specifically with respect to reimbursements for public schools and things that we provide there. Another big hole in the budget. The Medicaid cuts would be another big one as well. I think that's roughly $1 billion impact potentially on a state like Maryland. And that's true across the country. That's the $881 billion in negative impact by those cuts to Medicaid. That would include things like cutting Title I teachers and, funding for seniors and healthcare for them, people with disabilities, children. The Medicaid cuts are dramatic and dangerous if they're allowed to go through. Fortunately, the Republicans are starting to get the message that the public's starting to figure out what this would mean for them. And that's why you saw some of the angry town hall meetings in red states and red districts, even where Trump had carried the election by big numbers.
Congressman Glenn Ivey of the great state of Maryland, we appreciate you joining us here on Rising.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up next, judges are in the spotlight again. Are they being activists or are they upholding the law? We'll be back soon. Out of line? In a nutshell, that's what our next guest asserts about Judge Boasberg. In a recent Wall Street Journal op-ed, Dan Huff challenges the validity of U.S. District Court Judge James Boasberg's recent deportation order.
If you recall, last month, he ordered the administration not to deport anyone in its custody under the Alien Enemies Act, a 1798 wartime law Trump invoked over what he claimed was an invasion by the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua. Boasberg failed, however, to apply Rule 65, which mandates that a bond be imposed to any preliminary injunction.
Here to explain exactly what this seemingly obscure rule is Dan Huff, a senior fellow at American Path Initiative. Dan previously served in the first Trump administration. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you for having me.
So I read your op-ed. I want you to explain what this measure is, but I also am curious as to if the case here is as clear-cut as you suggest, that Judge Boasberg's ruling is invalid. I'm frankly curious why the Trump administration itself hasn't pressed the case that you're making. But explain your case and then maybe answer that second point.
So the core idea is that plaintiffs who seek preliminary injunctions have to have skin in the game. The federal law provides that. Now, remember, when you seek a preliminary injunction, this is pre-trial, meaning you're asking the judge to stop the government from doing something before there's been a full hearing on the merits. And that opens the door to a lot of mistakes. Now, there's a rule to address that. What happens if a mistake is made? And in the meantime, the government suffered costs in complying with this injunction that turned out later to be incorrect. Rule 65C requires plaintiffs seeking preliminary injunctions or temporary restraining orders to post bond to cover the costs and damages of the complying party in the event that the injunction is later ruled invalid. So, to bring it to this case, the judge, Judge Boasberg, ordered the government to turn planes around, to put aliens back in custody. All these things cost money. Now, what happens if the government did have authority to deport them and instead has to bear these costs? How do they get their money back? Rule 65C says the plaintiffs who sought that injunction had to have post bond. How much is that? That can be determined, but we know what the cost of deportation flights are. We know what the cost of holding people per day is. These are public numbers. I actually ran them, and it's probably like $1 to $4 million, depending on how many and for what period of time. In this case, the judge did not order those bonds whatsoever. He didn't even really discuss it, and that is a fatal defect, because what the rule says is that an injunction can issue only if the judge requires bond. No bond was required here. Therefore, the injunction was void ab initio from the outset.
What happens if the plaintiffs don't have $1 to $4 million to post in this case? Does the judge have some discretion on how much the bond is actually worth?
So the text of the rule makes no exceptions, and neither does the legislative history. In fact, if you look back at the legislative history, Congress specifically changed the rule to switch it from being discretionary to being mandatory. So there's no basis for any sort of public interest exception. In the indigent case that you bring up, remember, the doors to the courthouse are not shut to people who cannot afford the bond. What simply happens is they have to litigate the case all the way out to its completion before getting relief. There's no initial right to a preliminary injunction. It's all pre-trial. So you just go into court, you don't ask for a preliminary injunction, you litigate your case, and if you win, you receive the benefits of that. So no one is really being shut out from the process by enforcing this rule.
And just to get back to my initial question, if it's as clear-cut as that, why is Trump's Justice Department not pressing the case?
Well, I think that good ideas, sort of fresh ideas, sometimes take time to percolate in the system. There's a tendency in Washington to simply do what's always been done. And so I think you have to see over time if it starts getting out there. And in fact, it has. So after that article came out, I've actually written several pieces on it, but the president issued a memorandum requiring agencies to seek bonds. Senator Chuck Grassley, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, wrote a letter to the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, essentially asking her to press this issue harder. And in fact, if you look at the cases that have been filed, you will see that, in fact, the Justice Department has increasingly started asking for bond. So I think you're starting to see it develop. But as to why it didn't happen to start with, I think that people are very busy doing what they've always done, and no one's necessarily doing the original research, asking the fundamental questions. And so, I happen to have time to have done that, and so was pleased to be helpful.
Are there other cases where preliminary injunctions have been issued against the Trump administration that similarly did not address the bond question?
Yes, almost. I'd say half of them. In half of the cases or so, you have injunctions being set at a de minimis level, $100, or even zero. In a bunch of other cases, it hasn't even come up. So, for example, right now, you have a case pending before the Supreme Court. A district judge in California required the government to rehire 26,000 fired employees of the federal government who actually were in essentially a temporary status, a probationary status. So the government argues they could be fired. The bottom line is the judge is saying hire back these 26,000 people. That's an enormous cost. We're talking maybe $100 million a month. And in the order, the judge didn't even order a bond, didn't even discuss the bond question. It never even came up. Now, there's some permissive precedent that says, well, maybe the bond is discretionary. And as I've said, it really isn't. That's clear in the text, it's clear in the history. But even the courts that say there's some flexibility, even they say you have to at least consider it. That was not done here. The case is currently before the Supreme Court because the Justice Department has asked for a stay so that they do not have to rehire these 26,000 people. And we will see if that issue comes up in the court's consideration.
And just to be clear, because obviously, I'm not a lawyer and most of our audience won't be lawyers, I assume, is the imperative here on the judge to set the bond? Or is it just automatic? Is it the default that as the plaintiff, you have to post a bond and it is up to the judge to say what that amount should be?
It's the latter. The rule says that an injunction can issue only if there's a bond. And the amount of the bond is up to the judge, but the discretion is not uncabined. The amount has to be, under the rule, an amount adequate to cover the costs and damages that could be sustained by a wrongful injunction. But it is not the judge that is posting the bond, it is the plaintiffs, and the amount is set by the judge after considering the actual damages that could be caused.
There are some exceptions to, or at least one exception to the bond rule related to injunctions. What are those exceptions and why don't they apply in these cases?
So the one exception I believe you're referring to is that the rule itself says that the government does not have to post bond, but that is when the government is seeking an injunction. Here, the government is being sued. The rule refers to a case where the government is suing. Where the government is suing to obtain an injunction, the government does not need to post bond, but that's not at issue here. There are no other exceptions. And so it's really quite curious that none of the judges have really enforced this rule as it ought to be enforced. And it's actually very disappointing because what you have here in Judge Boasberg's case and many other cases are judges insisting on complete, precise compliance with the orders with which they issued. Right? The government is not deporting more aliens in contravention of the judge's order. It's simply, if it did anything wrong at all, it simply finished what it was already doing. So it's substantially complied. And yet the judge is saying that's not enough and I may hold you in contempt. He wants precise compliance. Well, if the judge is going to insist on precise compliance with his orders, he must precisely comply with the rules that bind him.
All right, Dan Huff, thank you so much for joining us this morning on Rising.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Up next, the government is knocking on your bedroom door. Well, sort of. We'll explain next. The U.S. government has a message for their personnel posted in China. Maintain a strong relationship with our allies, but it must be platonic.
American diplomats, their families, and security-cleared contractors in China and Hong Kong are banned from engaging in romantic or sexual relationships with Chinese citizens. According to the Associated Press, the policy took effect in January, shortly before US Ambassador Nicholas Burns left his post in Beijing.
At the Institute of Politics Forum earlier this week, Burns had this to say about maintaining strong relationships with US allies.
4 words. Be nice to allies. Seriously. Be nice to allies. Here's the reason I say that. When you're in a competition, this is an epic multi-decade competition. If we did a typical exercise here at the Kennedy School, if we asked the students, okay, objectively, on a series of matrices, who's more powerful, the US or China? Military power, tech power, and Graham and his studies have done a lot of this. Soft power, economic and trade power. It's pretty close. The Chinese line publicly is, oh, the United States is more powerful. I think we're near peer competitors.
But back to the spicier topic of personal relationships. Some US agencies did have strict rules on such relationships, but not a blanket ban. A non-fraternization mandate, as it is euphemistically known, has been unheard of since the Cold War.
The new directive mandates that anyone with an existing Chinese partner seek an exemption, end the relationship, or leave their post if the exemption is denied.
The US government's non-fraternization policies for other countries are unknown, as they are considered classified.
I'm glad that you had to read the fraternization because I don't think I could have done that twice.
We don't mind excessive fraternization in certain quarters, but apparently not with China. I mean, look, it's a fun story in one respect. I also think it gets to, we were talking earlier on in this show about TikTok and about Chinese government maneuvers and so forth. Of course, the oldest maneuvers in the book are still in place, which is people being honeypotted, seduced by enemy agents. I mean, if that's a problem, I guess it's a valid problem to try to create a deterrence against. I tend to think that it would be fine to trust people to simply report such relationships, and I'm not sure how closely the ban is going to be complied with, but it's an interesting idea for sure.
Yeah, I don't have any outright objections to this at all. Back in 2020, Axios did that bombshell report about Fang Fang, who was a Chinese agent who was getting close to several Midwestern mayors who she allegedly had sexual relationships with. She tried to help Roan get into Congress back in 2014. He ended up winning in 2016, and most notably had some kind of relationship with Eric Swalwell. We don't know the nature of that, but was helping him fundraise for his campaign, placed at least one intern in his office while he was serving on the House Intelligence Committee. So this is not unheard of for China to activate agents to get close to Americans, whether romantically or otherwise, in a way of either implementing blackmail, gathering intelligence, or otherwise trying to compromise them. So this seems pretty common sense to me. I haven't heard any real outcry about it at this point.
No, I think it's a story that excites a certain amount of prurient interest, to be perfectly honest. Look, the honeypotting, as you talk about, I mean, that has gone on, obviously, in the Cold War and for many, many years. One of the things that I was intrigued by whenever I was researching this was that one of the reasons there had been a blanket ban a generation ago, instilled or installed in 1987, after a US Marine was seduced by a Soviet agent. And that was a blanket ban on relationships with people in the Soviet bloc or in China. But it was relaxed in 1991 as the Cold War came to an end. So these things have a tradition, if we can call it that. I suppose I just feel the kind of idea of like, we're going to ban you from this. Are people always going to confess who they have romantic or sexual entanglements with? I'm skeptical of that, but I know, the policy itself, I understand the reason for it.
Yeah, same. I think probably what's happened is that self-reporting is not going well.
Right, I would imagine that.
So they've decided to go ahead and issue the outright ban so that there are consequences for people if they find out they haven't been reporting, perhaps more significant consequences than if there were just these exceptions to the rule. But it's, again, well known that China does do things like this. They send students to United States universities to steal research secrets and intellectual property and send it back to the CCP. And they use activated agents to get close to people who have access to intelligence information and report that back to the CCP. There's really no lengths at which they will not go to try to diminish U.S. influence, or at least take the secrets that the U.S. knows and use them for their own benefit. So again, I don't have a problem with it.
I noticed that the ban also does encompass family members of U.S. personnel, so I suspect that will make postings to China slightly less popular with people in late adolescence, the kids of diplomats and so on, hormones flying all over the place and banned from doing anything about it, at least with Chinese citizens. But
yeah, we'll see if there's any outcry against it. I haven't seen anything just yet. Maybe there's some intelligence official in China right now who's about to get married, and they're going to get denied an exception or something and be really upset.
Or maybe there's some libertarian objection to.
Maybe so. If only Robbie were here, he could inform us.
Argue for the overreach of government on romantic relationships with Chinese citizens. We have a lot more topics to talk about on Rising right after this. Did Chapel Roan just diss motherhood? That's the question that's being hotly debated online this week after the musician said this during an interview on the Call Her Daddy podcast.
All of my friends who have kids are in hell. I don't know anyone. I actually don't know anyone who's like happy and has children at this age. I have like a 1-year-old, like 3-year-old, 4 and under, 5 and under. I literally have not met anyone who's happy, anyone who has like light in their eyes, anyone who has slept.
These words sparked swift backlash from mothers on social media. Associate editor at Reason Magazine, Liz Wolfe, wrote on X, "Come over and play on the beach with us, Chapel. Then you will see. Children bring magic with them everywhere they go. They invite you back into the wide and wild world of play, one adults try so hard to escape and forget about at their own peril." And conservative-leaning magazine Ivey, which we talked about last week, posted, "No, Chapel, motherhood isn't hell."
But it's also brought the politics of motherhood to the forefront of the conversation. Singer Maren Morris weighed in on her experiences as a mom.
So many women leave this industry because they wanted to have a family and there was no way to tour and also have a kid. You work your entire life in music, no health care, no support, and then you also want to start a family, and it's just impossible to. So I think the bigger conversation should maybe be about like why this country makes people feel like this at all. Mothers are just so unsupported in this country, and I'm not talking about Chapel, I'm talking about this country does not support mothers. It doesn't support children. It doesn't support children once they're out of the womb. We don't have health care, we don't have child care.
Podcast host Recho Omonde also chimed in with her thoughts.
The people who have made me the most scared to become a mother are mothers. And I'm afraid that what Chapel said is all I see. Unfortunately, I related to exactly what Chapel said. Like, I see so many women who are like, this is miserable. And maybe they don't want to say that. What I see more is this overcompensation of like, I am not just a stay-at-home mom, I work. It's kind of like how Nepo babies are like, I am not a Nepo baby, I work hard. It's like, no one's saying you don't work hard. That's not what stay-at-home mom means. It just means that you don't work in the workplace, that you work out of the home. I feel like attacked sometimes by people trying to prove to me that like, I am not an idiot, I work. And I'm like, okay, great. And that's the only reason why I think people are responding to this, like, you know, these crash outs is like, because why do you care? If you're not who she's referring to, why do you care?
So a huge topic there, Amber. I think as the man on this panel, I should not go first. What do you make of that, or what stood out to you about this debate?
Well, I saw a lot of friends of mine who have children quite incensed by this, not because they were taking it so personally, but because they felt that it provided a really harmful message to young women who want to have children, that they're going to be miserable if they do. And they've pointed out that's actually the opposite of what happened to me. When I had my kids, I became happier than ever because I had this newfound purpose in my life, and I was able to share this joy with my husband, with my kids, of bringing new life into the world and getting to raise them and see how they grow as people. And just a smattering of online comments that I thought were instructive from some anonymous accounts who talk about motherhood and child rearing quite a lot. Chapel Roan going on Call Her Daddy saying none of her friends with kids are happy is a prime example of why you cannot just vent to anyone, because I guarantee she has this perspective because a few of her mom friends are going through it, and may a friendship like that never find me. May the friendships of narcissistic childless women with no sense of loyalty ever find me. And then another person who said they love Chapel Roan said this comment reinforces the stigma that if you complain about motherhood, you must hate your life and your kids. Motherhood is hard, not miserable, and we don't hate our kids. And that's, I think, the disconnect that Chapel Roan is missing, that in the early years, it is obviously incredibly difficult, right? You're running on a low amount of sleep, your schedule's kind of hectic, you're cleaning up all kinds of bodily fluids and dealing with illnesses and things like that, and it's hard, and you're tired, and sometimes it feels like it sucks. But underneath all of that is, again, the joy, the purpose, the fulfillment that you get from having kids. And there are studies that consistently show that in the early years of a child's life, in the first 1 to 5 years, for example, women's happiness diminishes slightly and then increases significantly as the kids get older.
Sure. So first of all, in, I guess, somewhat defense of Chapel Roan, I'm glad we played the clip of her talk in there, because she's getting all this online flack for being, I guess, insulting of mothers, or purportedly insulting of mothers. And I didn't really take her tone to be that. I thought, to your point, that her tone was more about the difficulties of it. I think she mentioned about her friends lacking sleep and so on and so forth. And she was obviously using a pretty colourful phrase by saying that mothers are in hell. But I didn't think that she was really like slamming or condemning mothers. I took it to be that firstly she was underscoring the difficulty that many of her friends are facing. But I also sort of thought that she was speaking up for a choice not to have children, which is obviously as valid as any other choice and doesn't, you know, diminish anybody if they come to that opinion. And I sometimes think that even though it is frequently said that we live in such a sort of socially liberal or socially progressive time, that sometimes women who make the active or proactive choice not to have children because that's not what they feel called to do, that is portrayed as somehow a strange choice. And I don't think it is a strange choice. I think it's a completely valid choice.
I guess I viewed her comments a little bit differently just because of the way that she talked about the misery and the being in hell and the strength of that language, as you put it, as I have to wonder like what it is specifically her friends are saying to her. Are they saying, oh, gosh, I'm so tired, this is so hard? Or are they really saying like, I regret having kids and I wish I had never done it? Because those are two really vastly different things. Yeah. And conflating those into this one bucket of, well, I don't know anybody who has kids who's happy,
yeah.
quote, happy, is the problem where if you have young women who do, or who are grappling with the decision or who do want to have kids, see that and go, oh my goodness, is that my life if I have a child? That's horrifying.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's true that you could interpret it that way. I still think that as a culture overall, we still celebrate motherhood, or certainly celebrate, you know, having children. And so if people are taking Chapel Roan's comments as in a different direction, to me she's battling against a much bigger tide, even if that is her intention. And you know, it's interesting talking about this. In the newspaper business, it's quite rare for articles to stick in your mind over years, but years and years ago, I remember reading a piece in The Guardian from a woman who had had children and they were now grown, and she said that she regretted having children. Not that she didn't love her kids or not that anything had gone massively wrong with her kids, but that she had felt that motherhood had stopped her, restricted her, changed her choices in ways that she ultimately didn't think was right for her life. And that perspective is so unusual, I think, to hear in any very mainstream platform, that I've remembered it all these years, you know?
Yeah, I hope her kids didn't see that article.
I know.
Gosh.
I assume it was under a pseudonym. I can't recall that detail now.
Yeah. I think, you know, generally, on a personal level, culturally, we are still very excited when people get pregnant and have kids, and we celebrate that. But there is this, I think, other toxic discourse about how people who have kids are breeders. You see that I'm a big Redditor. It's like my alternative to TikTok.
Sure.
And gosh, the way people talk about kids on that platform is just devastating. They refer to people as breeders. The kids are crotch goblins. There's a lot of cultural backlash to people who have large families. They accuse those parents of the parentification of the older kids because they help in the rearing of the younger children. They accuse them of creating an environment of abuse effectively against some of the children. They think that large families, particularly religious ones, are weird or cultish. And that kind of discourse is, I think, really, really despicable and disgusting. I have so many close friends of mine who grew up in large families who are so much better for it and experienced really joyous childhoods and are still so close with all of their siblings. And Maren Morris's clip there talking about how it's hard for women to go on tour when they have kids, and how the answer is that basically we have to give everyone like free childcare. I think one of the ways that this debate gets muddied and a bit confused is that it used to be there were a couple of trade-offs that you could make as a woman who wanted to continue working or not. You would either choose to leave the workforce and take care of your kids, or you would go back into the workforce and you would either pay for daycare, or you would have a multi-generational family or family around you who would help with raising the kids while you were out of the workplace. And while I am obviously cognizant of the fact that some women have to work because they can't subsist on one income, or they're single mothers and they have no choice but to put their kid in daycare, I think just reflexively saying that we need free daycare for all women because all women have to be able to go back to work kind of misses a huge factor in this decision making, which is that daycare is not the best option for your kids. There is study after study that indicates the first 3 years of development are the most important in a child's life, and they develop severe attachment issues when they are not at home with one parent or the other, particularly with mom. So when women are making that decision, I hope that we don't get to this place where we say, well, childcare is free, so you can drop your kid off and go to work and everything's going to be fine. That is a really, really weighty issue that has a lot of impacts on the child. And for women who can make the decision of whether or not to go back to work, I just hope that that's included in the conversation.
Yeah, I agree that it's a very weighty decision, absolutely. I mean, I'm thinking back to when I was a small child, and to your point about extended families. My grandmother looked after me while my mother worked. Had that option not been available, I don't know what my mother would have done, because she couldn't afford not to work. And so that sort of stuff is, I think, very, very important. And I take the point about childcare and about the importance of those very early years. They're obviously vitally important. I guess I would cast it in a much bigger frame, which is why there are women who have to work because they literally could not survive without earning often very low income wages. And why can we not, in some fashion, address that problem and make work better paid, whether by raising the minimum wage
Tariffs.
or whatever.
We're back to tariffs.
Taxing the rich, Amber. It's the way forward. That's what we'll do in the end.
We're going to save motherhood with tariffs.
Well, or taxing the rich.
Or taxing the rich.
I would prefer the latter.
That's going to do it for us today on Rising. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. We'll see you next week.